Chapter 12, Policing and Diversity, Part 2. In this PowerPoint, we're going to focus exclusively on women in policing. And so if we discuss women generally in policing, what are some of the things that we know? Well, it seems that if we ask, well, why would women be good police officers? And believe me, that question has been asked. I've had students in my classes ask it, and some have really argued the women shouldn't be police officers, and usually the women in the class have put those people in their place pretty quickly and have proven that women can certainly stand up for themselves and are the equals of men in every way, and superior to men in some ways, just as men may do some things better than women. So again, it's not that women and men are one is better built for policing than others. That was a long time thought, that men are built for policing and women aren't. But instead, what we've generally found is, if we want to make the argument for why women can be great police officers, then we can look at certain skills. So for instance, the FBI recruiter who I knew in Pittsburgh, he would go to job fairs and he would have his kiosk that had all kinds of information about the FBI. And he said, the typical people would kind of come up, the men would come up and ask about the FBI, but he would notice that women would just kind of give a quick glance and walk by. So he really wondered, why is this happening? Did I forget to wear my deodorant today? Does my breath stink? Why aren't they coming over and talking to me? So he decided to start walking out from behind his table and start talking to these women as they start to walk by. And they would give reasons when he asked them. He said, why don't you want to work for the FBI? They would say things like, well, I don't want to get shot. And he would say, well, you know what, I don't either. I didn't join the FBI because I wanted to get shot. And then they might say something like, well, I don't want to bust down doors. And he said, I'm not really a big guy. I don't do it either. And he said, but if you want to join that, he said, we have a unit that will bust down doors. And if you want to do that, we can teach you, regardless of your size, we can teach you how to do it, and you can do it. So he would, kind of in an ad hoc way, he would try to deal with their issues with the FBI. But he wanted to do better, so he went and worked with some professors at the University of Pittsburgh, and asked them, how do men and women differ? And they probably looked at him and said, didn't your mother ever talk to you? And he said, no, I don't mean that. I mean, and they're thinking, why would women make better police officers? And so what women tend, and this is very general, so certainly you can find men who do it better than women in individual cases, and, et cetera, et cetera. But in general, women tend to be better communicators. So both with spoken and unspoken language. So women are better at reading body language generally than men. So men might not pick up on certain cues, but women can. So if you have an interrogator this is the FBI, and you're interrogating a terrorist, women may be better able to speak to that person, and they may be able to read body clues that the men just aren't picking up on. So this is one reason to hire women. They tend to be better team builders. So the FBI was especially interested in this in the post 9/11 period, because you're going to have to build teams with other agencies, with other units within the FBI, and you're going to have to bring people together to work together. And so when men get together, men tend to focus on the pecking order. Who is the top person here? Women tend to be more geared towards including people, being as inclusive as possible, building a team. So when men get together, and I'm sure both the men and women who are listening to this have experienced this, if a couple guys get together to talk about the previous weekend, the first guy's going to say something like, man, I got really drunk. And the second guy is probably going to say something like, oh, you think you got drunk? I got even drunker. Oh yeah? Well, I remember a time and then when I got really drunk. Yeah, you thought that was really drunk? I got even drunker than that, And so it's a competition. Whereas when women get together, it's more likely to say, oh, you went out drinking the other night, where'd you go? Who'd you go with? They're listening to the story. They're not trying to beat that story with a better story of their own. And so this is something that men can learn from women, that women can teach to police departments, but again, we can use these better communication and better team building skills. The whole notion about women aren't able to defend themselves, this was something that when I had students who didn't want women to be police officers, this is what they would routinely say. women can't defend themselves. We can teach anyone, regardless of gender, regardless of size, we can teach anyone to properly defend themselves. Okay, we give them tools, we give them a sidearm, we give them a taser, we give them pepper spray, but we teach them physical techniques to actually deal with pretty much anyone. So that old notion should be gone. It isn't, unfortunately, but it should be gone that women somehow physically can't do the job. They can. And so, I'm always going to be someone who's going to encourage more female students to think about policing and to become a police officer. We need more women on the job because they do bring these skills like better communication and team building and those things to policing. They often tend to be able to use less force. Now we're still trying to figure this out. If you remember our use of force chapter, do women and men really differ? But it looks like overall women do tend to solve problems with less force than men. And it may just be the fact that they're a woman. And this may sound sexist, but it appears to be true that maybe it's that person who's behind the door just waiting to beat the first police officer who walks through the door. When they see that police officer is a woman, maybe something in their head says, I can't hit a woman. If this is a male suspect, I can't hit a woman, or maybe they're afraid that a woman is going to show them up, that it's going to beat them up. Whatever the reason, they don't fight. They're more likely to give in. So we talked about this with the use of force. Women may be able to diffuse the situation just because they're a woman. And so maybe there's less need for force because they're women. But it's also probably because they're better communicators. They can communicate and convince the person to obey them rather than use physical force to compel it. Women supervisors. Now there's this notion that women are more caring and nurturing than men. And maybe that's true in general. But at least in the first and second generation of police officers, that might not have been true, that women are more nurturing, because we often saw, as we'll talk about in just a second, that because of this, they were often put in, when they were hired as police officers, they were assigned to deal with juveniles. Because she's a woman, she can deal with kids. But the first and second generation, maybe even it's still true somewhat today, if you were going to be a woman and join the male-dominated profession of policing, you might not be the, quote, typical woman. You might have more of the male qualities. You might be more aggressive. You might be more assertive. All of these kinds of things. And so maybe you're not that nurturing, motherly type. You don't want to have kids, perhaps. You want to go out and have adventure instead. And so we associate that more with men than women. We're minimizing that, where the roles are not as far apart as they used to be, but still there's some trace of this, that the girls are playing with dolls while the boys are out playing cops and robbers and those kinds of things. And so the girl who wants to grow up to become a police officer, maybe she's the one who's playing cops and robbers. She's not playing with dolls. And so when we hired this woman and we expected her to be really nurturing, that might have been the worst thing in the world to say, here, we're going to put you in with the juveniles, because she didn't want to be with them. And so, but there still may be that assumption that, if we have a rape victim, let's have a woman talk to her because she will really understand, or a domestic violence victim. Again, maybe she doesn't. Maybe she's the worst person to put in because she views herself as a really independent woman who could never imagine herself being abused, could never imagine herself being raped, any of these things. And so she's tougher on the victim than what a male police officer might be. So we have to be aware of these things. But it still seems to be true that we have these notions that women are more likely to be understanding of a broader range of problems. And that's true for women supervisors. So with women supervisors, their subordinates, we found, are more likely to come to the female supervisor rather than the male supervisor with a broader range of issues. So if this police officer has a problem at home, maybe it's, and by problem I don't mean a terrible problem. It could be, hey, I really need Friday off because my kid has a soccer game. Who are they more likely to go to? Oftentimes the female supervisor, because they think the female will understand the family issues and say, yeah, I understand, we'll give you the night off. We'll switch shifts with someone else. Those kinds of things. Or maybe they come to the female supervisor if they're experiencing a personal problem. I'm really feeling depressed, I'm feeling burned out, I'm feeling this, I'm feeling that. And they feel more comfortable talking to women than to men. Again, maybe the supervisor they're talking to isn't, quote, the typical woman, and she might not be very helpful, but the thought is, if you're a woman, I can talk to you about this. So that certainly can be a positive thing if the female supervisors are actually listening and receptive. That means we can get our subordinates to open up with more things than they might if they only had male supervisors. And so around male supervisors, they only talk about work-related issues and not family, not personal, those things, those kinds of things. What's some of the general history of women in policing? We're just going to go over this pretty quickly, and I'm not going to expect you to remember all these numbers and these dates and these names, but there were some women in policing before 1910, but mostly they weren't sworn police officers. They worked with the police. They might have assisted them. So maybe they were part of, the police had brought in auxiliaries who were women, so assistants who were women. So they weren't carrying guns. They didn't have badges. They didn't have arrest powers, but they might work with special groups of victims or offenders. So maybe they would work with the juvenile offenders. Maybe they would work with runaways, with women who had been victimized. And so, again, these weren't usually fully sworn police officers, or they weren't fully sworn police officers, but they might assist with certain aspects of policing. There's a lot of debate over who was the first American policewoman, because it's hard to tell whether some of these early trailblazers actually had full police powers. But generally, if we define the first American policewoman as the first woman who had full police powers, that would be Alice Stebbin Wells, who in 1910 became a member of the Los Angeles Police Department. Again, I'm not going to ask you to memorize these names or these dates, but I'm just trying to give you some background. After Wells, we had more women hired. Still not very many, and they still usually, even if they were fully sworn, they weren't treated as equals. They were still mostly seen as, you're helping us, you're supporters, you're not really police officers. So again, they might be confined just to specific roles like working with juveniles, with runaways, with women, female victims, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They weren't going to be on the homicide. They weren't going to be a homicide detective. They weren't going to be working undercover. They weren't going to be generally patrolling. Now, there were exceptions, certainly, but in general, they probably weren't out on the streets patrolling the criminals because that was still seen as unwomanly. You can't do that. You can't put a woman out there. 1950s, after World War II, we did see a significant increase in the number of policewomen. Were they still fully respected as equals? Probably not. 1964, we have some important federal laws that are passed that affect everyone, not just police departments, but the Civil Rights Law of 1964 established protections for gender, and when hiring, it also applied to other areas, but in hiring and employment, gender was protected. In 1972, that was expanded to cover also public agencies like policing. So this is when you really start to see more and more lawsuits brought to require the police to hire under Title VII to hire women. And so this is, if we're really looking for, if we're looking at the numbers of policewomen in policing over the years, you're going to start to see a spike in the 1970s. You're going to see those numbers really start to increase, and it's largely due to this federal law that required police departments to no longer discriminate against women. Did they still discriminate? Yes, certainly. Was there still pressure put on applicants, female applicants, and this could apply to minority applicants too if we were discussing that, but was there still pressure? If you were the only woman in a police department, if you were the only black or Hispanic officer in a police department, were you going to feel lonely? Was there going to maybe be pressure in these early days to force you out of the department, to make life miserable for you? Yeah. And so we really have to respect those first women, and if we talk about race, those first minority officers who really said, I'm going to endure the pressure so that I can open the door wider for people who follow me. And so that was certainly true for women in the 1970s. You were going to be, really alone in that police department. Are you going to make it? Or are they going to pressure you to get out? And so as you make a foothold and more women see what you're doing and decide they're going to take a chance also, we start to see the numbers increase. We didn't have any female Pennsylvania State Police troopers until the 1970s. And I wish I could put a picture up here that a recruiter once had with her that showed what the uniforms looked like. And it was, not exactly the easiest thing to police in. The first female troopers wore skirts. So imagine being taken seriously by a criminal as you're in a skirt, and imagine chasing or struggling with a suspect while you're in a skirt. So, eventually we changed the uniform to make it more conducive to policing for both men and women. But even the uniforms were really emphasizing the femininity of police officers, still setting them apart. The first female police chief was Penny Harrington in Oregon. We've had others. We still have a glass ceiling that keeps women from maybe becoming police chiefs. They're overlooked when the hiring takes place, but we do have some major police departments that have had police chiefs who are women. And so gradually that glass ceiling is breaking. We're seeing some cracks in it, but we still need to bust through it. So where do we find some of this discrimination? We're going to talk about the glass ceiling in a second in this slide, but we can find it right from the very beginning at police academies. We need to go through and try to understand, where discrimination might occur. So it can occur in the hiring stage, the recruiting stage, but also once that person has come into the policing, is she still discriminated against? So there was a study I used to assign that dealt with a researcher who was female and went into a police academy undercover. She had the permission of the administration that ran the academy, but no one else was told that she was a researcher. They all thought that she wanted to become a police officer. And when she was in that police academy, now again, this might not be true of all academies, because we hope that academies understand this and adjust what they do, but what she found was there was a hidden curriculum at the academy. And what we mean by hidden curriculum is all of their official documents were gender neutral. They would say he, she, those kinds of things. They wouldn't just exclusively use one gender pronoun. They wouldn't always say he did this, he did that. But the official materials for the academy were gender neutral. But the actual teaching that was going on and the experience was very much gender biased. And so again, this might not be true at every academy, but at the academy where she went, she found there was a hidden curriculum. And what that hidden curriculum was teaching was police officers are men, not women. And so, for instance, when an instructor would talk about a police officer, that instructor would only use the masculine pronoun. That officer would only say he did this, he did that. The only time women really showed up in any of the training exercises, at least in the hypotheticals, the only time the instructors ever referred to women tended to be as victims or witnesses. Then they would talk about women. So the implicit message was the police officers are men, the people who need to be helped by the police officers are women. So women can't be police officers. Men are always, even when they're police officers, the men are going to have to help them. And so there were other examples too. We won't go into all the examples, but there were a lot of other examples that really showed that, for instance, the male cadets would get together in groups and talk about sports and other things and exclude the women. And so they had a patronizing kind of view of women, that when women would come around and maybe the men were engaged in some rough language, someone would say, "Oh, the ladies are here, we have to be nice." And so they would change the way they were talking, the way they were relating. And so, as probably most of you have already found out, if you want to advance in an organization, it's who you know as much as what you know. And so if you're not in the in-group, if you're excluded, if you're an outsider, if people can't be natural around you, you're probably not going to advance very far. And that's what this researcher found, that the male cadets really bonded. They were bonding with the instructors, and the female cadets weren't able to. Also, there were examples of just some outright discrimination, really kind of sending a message that women can't do certain things. That, for instance, when they did self-defense training, either they would only pair the women with women, because they would joke and say, the instructors would say, "We don't want anybody touching anything inappropriately." When you're going to be dealing, if you're if you're a female police officer, you're going to be dealing with male suspects. You need to know how to struggle with a male suspect, and you're probably not thinking of any kind of sexual encounter with this person while you're struggling with them. That's not on your mind. But getting romantic with them, getting sexual with them is not on your mind. You're concerned about resisting, or their resistance and overcoming it. And so you need to learn how to deal with a male suspect. But again, in the training, They treated it more as, oh, we don't want to touch anything inappropriate. Or the other thing that they would do is pair the female cadets with the largest, strongest man that was in the group, the biggest person in the group, period. And they would pair them up with them without giving them any kind of real training to tell the woman who might be a lot smaller, how do you actually deal with someone that large? They wouldn't give them that instruction. They would let them then try it first and usually fail and then say, see, that shows women can't handle it. Well, probably none of the men could have handled it either because they weren't as big as this, this guy. And so they were setting women up for failure. So this was part of the hidden curriculum. We need to address that. Are we, in our examples, are we giving equal time to men and women? So I do that on the test. If you look on the test, I will split time between having, when I give a test question, I say, Officer so-and-so, sometimes Officer so-and-so will be a man, sometimes Officer so-and-so will be a woman. So I purposely do that on the test so that I'm sending that implicit message that, yes, women are police officers and women can be police officers. So what's the acculturation in a police academy? Who gets along? Because chances are, you go through something difficult like the police academy and you make friends, you're going to stay friends throughout your career. So if the men are all getting together and the women are kind of excluded and the men are the in-group, is that going to carry over into police work as well when you're actually in the department? Do we have double standards, higher standards for women than for men? So are we constantly second-guessing women? Constantly saying, well, if there's a fight call and an officer says, I need assistance, and everybody shows up, but it happens that maybe the female officer is the last one to show up. If it was a male officer, we might look at that and think nothing of it. We might say, okay, they still showed up, and they probably had a good reason for showing up late. Maybe there was heavy traffic and they were clear on the other side of town. Or they were dealing with another call and they couldn't end it right away. But if it's a female officer who shows up last, we might say, see, that reinforces our stereotype. She was afraid to show up, that's why she was last. And so do we have that kind of double standard where the same behavior that a man could do and never be questioned, a woman is questioned for it? And so we need to identify that and address that. Do we pigeonhole females? So again, what we mean by pigeonholing, do we put them in particular roles in the police department, even if that's not what they really want to do? So do we put them with the juvenile division? Well, the juvenile division is not a quick route to promotion. And so are we always putting the female police officers there? Do we ever let them be undercover narcotics officers? Or do we ever encourage them to become detectives? Or, can they join the tactical team, the SWAT team? Or are we always putting them in these positions that we think are more traditional female positions? So we want to avoid that. So the juvenile units, the victim units, those kinds of things. If a woman police officer wants to work in those, great. But if she doesn't, and we're putting a hurdle in front of her in her career advancement, and we're making her feel miserable at work because she's in a position she doesn't enjoy, then we're discriminating against her. So I said the average representation of women is around 15%. The glass ceiling, now that we're starting to see some numbers, we're not seeing a representational amount of women in policing. If we were, we would see about 50% of policing would be women, police officers would be women. We're only at about 15%, but even with 15%, we can start to, it's somewhat of a critical mass. Are they advancing up through the ranks? Or is there still a glass ceiling that's preventing them from becoming captains, sergeants, lieutenants, commissioners, chiefs, et cetera, et cetera? Is there defeminization? What we mean by defeminization is, are we essentially forcing women to give up their identity as women? That if you want to be a police officer, you got to act like a man. And is that going on? Well, obviously, if we really want diversity, we don't want it. We want them to have their identity, whatever that identity is. Maybe they're a little bit more masculine, maybe they're more feminine, whatever they are. Can women feel comfortable policing as women? Or do we try to force them to become men in essence? What have women officers told us about their jobs? Well, and if we talk about lesbian officers, we actually find that they claim that their gender, the fact that they're a woman, has prevented them from advancing in their career more than their sexual preference. That in fact there's a weird kind of discrimination. We'll talk about this a little bit in the next PowerPoint lecture when we talk about gay and lesbian officers, that because policing has been a male-dominated profession, there's kind of been an assumption that if you're a woman and you become a police officer, you must be a lesbian. And this was true for women athletes for a long time, that if you're going to play sports, you must be a lesbian. Obviously, that's not true. But what lesbian officers have reported is, it's the straight women who are actually sometimes discriminated against, that their fellow officers don't believe that they're actually straight. And so that's changing. I mean, it certainly is changing as we're becoming, as a society, more understanding, more knowledgeable about sexual preference. But at least in the early days, there was an assumption, that if you're a woman, you must be a lesbian. So there was an acceptance for lesbians. So if there was any kind of glass ceiling, it was because they were a woman, not because they were lesbians. How can women, how do women officers, if they feel that there's a double standard for them, how can they gain respect from colleagues? Well, they've reported that if they do one of these three things, they can often gain the respect of colleagues. Now, it's important to note that they feel they have to do one of these. That a male police officer, a new male police officer, can come into the force and they have instant respect because they're a man. But women have to earn the respect. And so how can they earn the respect? Well, they can make a significant arrest. So, they catch a major drug dealer. They pull over somebody for a traffic violation and it turns out to be someone who's wanted for serious crimes, and they arrest that person. They solve a crime, any of these kinds of things. So if they make a significant arrest, that can put them on equal footing that, hey, this woman's okay. Maybe the other ones aren't okay, but this one is. So if that's the thinking within the police department, then making a significant arrest can start to get rid of some discrimination, at least for that police officer, maybe not for all female police officers. Can they prove themselves in a fight? So, the assumption is, as we've said, the old notion that we hope is dispelled by now, but it isn't always, that women can't handle themselves in a fight. Do they prove that they can handle themselves in a fight? So they get into a struggle with a suspect and they come out on top. That can gain their respect. They can prove that they're tough. Finally, do they earn a promotion? So even if you didn't respect them because they're a woman, you might respect them because they outrank you. So have they earned a promotion? So any of these three things, making a significant arrest, proving yourself in a fight, getting a promotion, can be a way to gain respect. You should just have instant respect when you come onto the force, that you've gone through the academy, you've passed all the employment checks, those things. But again, that isn't always the case. You have to pass an additional test, which is prove yourself as a police officer, prove that a woman can do this job. We need to break down these barriers. As I said already, just to remind you, women tend to be better communicators and team builders. And that female supervisors tend to be better dealing with their subordinates in a wider variety of issues than male supervisors.